Hello and welcome to Comic Book Herald's Best Comics Ever. I'm your host, Dave Busing, the founder and editor-in-chief of comicbookherald.com. And today I'll be talking about the 1-year anniversary of Marvel Fresh Start. This is the lineup, the line-wide era of Marvel Comics that began in May 2018. If you want to be very precise, Avengers #1 came out May 2nd, 2018. So it's been approximately 1 year, and it's time to consider the success or failures of the era, as well as the biggest developments during this time. If you're not familiar with where comics are at, specifically where Marvel Comics are at, throughout 2018 and 2019, there may be some light spoilery material as far as where certain characters like Spider-Man, the Avengers, and Thor are at. If you really want to avoid those types of things, I recommend heading on over to comicbookherald.com, checking out the Marvel reading order, and diving in for the modern era, circa 1998, and the guide section that I have there called Marvel Knights to Avengers Disassembled. For everyone else, though, let's get into Marvel Fresh Start. I think for some context, going into Fresh Start, Marvel was definitely struggling with a scattershot lack of cohesion that resulted in 3 separate eras within the span of 3 years, essentially. So the way that Marvel Comics has been segmented for most fans, really over the past now 4 years, is in 2015, there was a major event called Secret Wars, and it's the 2015 Secret Wars because there was an event by the same name in 84-85, and that event is basically a line in the sand segmentation where everything before that is of a piece and everything after is sort of Marvel's attempt to find their footing again. Big picture, Fresh Start picks up on a handful of shared universe storylines, most notably 2017's Secret Empire, a majorly controversial event that found Captain America as an apparent sort of agent of Hydra, and oddly, the Marvel Legacy #1 one-shot, which was written by now Avengers, Thor, and War of the Realms writer Jason Aaron, that Legacy one-shot actually gives you a lot of Fresh Start information and storylines that have been picked up since then. So, as this suggests, these connections mean that Fresh Start is not a full reboot of the Marvel Universe. These stories are still very much in the modern continuation of a continuity that I think is most easily traced back again to about 1998 and the rise of Marvel Knights. But that said, even the 98 sort of Marvel Knights turning of the page for Marvel Comics, even that is tied to the continuity that goes all the way back to 1961 Fantastic Four #1. Do you have to read every single comic? Well, if you're part of the My Marvelous Year Club, which I am, another podcast I do, then I highly recommend you check that out. But no, you don't, for modern continuity's sake. And honestly, that's a whole different discussion. So let's keep going into Marvel Fresh Start. What was the strategy as Marvel came into 2018? What were the core tenets? I think there are 2 very definable themes that run throughout Marvel Fresh Start strategy. The first is that there were going to be, and there have been, new creative teams and voices behind most major series. So there have been some longer-running writers and artists, teams or series that continued on through into Marvel Fresh Start. For example, Jason Aaron stays on Thor as the writer. Ta-Nehisi Coates stays on as the writer on Black Panther. In some cases, like Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, stayed on with Ryan North as writer and Erica Henderson for a bit before Derek Charm took over. And that series hasn't even changed its numbering, which leads into the other thing, which is most series relaunched with new #1s and fresh teams of creators. So a vast majority of well-known Marvel properties relaunched with new #1s. Just to give you a sampling, you had an Avengers #1, Amazing Spider-Man #1, Black Panther #1, Captain America #1, Immortal Hulk #1, Captain Marvel #1, Doctor Strange #1, Iron Man #1, Thor #1, Venom #1. The list goes on. And of course, in each of those instances, you have new creative teams. Some of the real standout ones, I would say, would be Al Ewing and Joe Bennett on Immortal Hulk, Donny Cates and Ryan Stegman on Venom, Kelly Thompson et al. On Captain Marvel, Nick Spencer and former Invincible virtuoso Ryan Otley. So it's new creators. It's kind of giving the new #1 is a trick, I guess. I don't even know if it's a trick at this point that Marvel has, I think most would say, abused this decade of giving the appearance of a quote-unquote fresh start, but it's something that they were doing in vast numbers here. The other central theme that Marvel Fresh Start really focused on, back to basics. The notion of Marvel going back to their roots is very much at the core of Fresh Start. Given that this was also the promised foundation of the very short-lived Marvel legacy, it would be easy to question whether this was just sort of a Marvel talking point. Are they just saying this to appease the fans who were sort of turned off and confused by the rate of change that was happening across the Marvel Universe in the post-Secret Wars landscape? In the case of Fresh Start, honestly, that doesn't seem to be the case. They actually seem pretty committed to this back to basics idea. Some examples: Avengers #1 focuses on bringing the big three, Steve Rogers, Tony Stark, and Thor, the founding Avengers, getting the band back together after a stretch that found Captain America working for Hydra, Tony in a coma, and Thor unworthy. So they were going through some tough times. I've said, and I will say here again, I would have really liked the all new, all different Marvel era more if those big three players, instead of just being brought low, were almost brought off the board. I think Marvel tried to kind of have their cake and eat it too, as far as developing legacy substitutes for those heroes while simultaneously keeping those heroes around. It worked better in some instances than others, a la Jane Foster's Thor in The Mighty Thor. But regardless, they're all back. They're all generally back to their power sets and their standing that we kind of know, or probably more importantly for the publisher, that MCU fans might be aware of. Likewise, the first arc of Amazing Spider-Man is literally called back to basics, with Nick Spencer and Ryan Ottley returning Peter Parker to his down on his luck average Joe-sized problems, as opposed to what Peter was coming out of, which was a captain of industry running Parker Industries. So he was like in a sort of a Tony Stark-esque role, and that has come crashing down around him. He now can barely maintain a job at the Bugle, but Peter is perhaps considering getting back with Mary Jane. So that would be the back to basics ideas. A handful of series relaunches very much play into this idea as well, with Marvel relaunching Fantastic Four and Uncanny X-Men with new #1 issues after both series ran into that Secret Wars size wall in 2015. I will say here, the addition of both series back to the Marvel landscape does help to create a stronger sense of a whole shared universe. I tend to think that Marvel is just more whole when Fantastic Four is present, and when you have Uncanny X-Men as your flagship X-Men title. I think importantly, the back to basics approach is generally not just replaying Marvel's greatest hits, or even just, fan service to maybe the old timers who have a certain expectation of what a Marvel comic should look like. I think it's very important that Marvel continue to push forward with some of the ideas and developments and new characters that came out of the all new, all different Marvel era. I've long said we have decades and decades of this shared universe history. I don't want to see the same sorts of Iron Man stories retold. I don't want to see the same sort of Spider-Man stories retold in the 616 universe, but we are seeing creators still finding ways to add to this tapestry and develop their own voices. I would point to, for example, Jason Aaron's Avengers. We have Black Panther as the team leader, despite the inclusion of the big three. We have Robbie Ray as Ghost Rider as the team's Kitty Pryde, and the Agents of Wakanda enter the picture into the run as these sort of amazing supporting cast left field wildcards. As far as the events of Fresh Start go, lest you think that a fresh start would mean fewer events for Marvel Comics, this has not been true. The publisher is still very committed to the event-centric model of superhero comics for good and for ill. Just to call out a few, there's Infinity Countdown and Infinity Wars, which was a cosmic event that really spiraled out of Jerry Dugan, the writer's run on Guardians of the Galaxy, and obviously was clearly an attempt to cash in on Avengers Infinity War, also coming out in 2018. There was The Hunt for Wolverine and The Return of Wolverine. There was Extermination, which was a fine but pretty important X-Men event. There was Spider-Geddon, which was really just a sequel to 2014 Spider-Verse. And then right now, ongoing as I record this, and as we are, right at that 1-year birthday stage of Fresh Start, there's Age of X-Man, which is a X-Men alternate reality story, and there's War of the Realms, which is the one that I'm most into. It's the culmination of Jason Aaron's now 7-year run on Thor comics. I've done a video and a podcast and all sorts of content on Comic Book Herald about the road to the War of the Realms and what comics you should be reading. This one promises to really operate as the event kicking off Fresh Start Year 2. So it's both an event of the Fresh Start era and the one that will most dictate, I think, what Fresh Start Year 2 is going to look like. But it's definitely the one I'm most excited about. So I would say I'm about to get into the, is it working? Is Fresh Start good question? As far as events are concerned, it's a bit dicey. And I think, honestly, again, the best event has only been running for a month and, has a bit of road to go before we could actually say it's been good. That said, for my money, Fresh Start is more consistent than the 2015 to 2017 eras that preceded it. And honestly, that War of the Realms and Jason Aaron's work in particular across Thor and Avengers, it provides a clearer universe-wide through line, which I think was one of the biggest items that was missing in that preceding 3-year sort of haze that Marvel found themselves in. I do think if you're just looking at the top of what are the must-reads from this era, if you're looking at the best of the best, I think you could even pull from an all-new, all-different Marvel in, that 2016 range and find just as many, if not more, high-end great reads. Like if you look at all-new, all-different Marvel, my favorite reads from that year, 2016, Ultimates, Vision, Mighty Thor, All New Wolverine, Mockingbird, and the start of Ta-Nehisi Coates on Black Panther. These are all great, great comics in my opinion, and books that I would highly recommend to any Marvel fan. If you're looking at Fresh Start, I would say I've got about 5, and it's kind of a reach to get there, that I would consider must-reads. Those would be Immortal Hulk, which is off the charts good, Venom, which is I'm not a huge Venom guy, but it's up there. Runaways by Rainbow Rowell and Chris Anka is excellent. I would say the Coates suite, which I'm counting as Ta-Nehisi Coates, is continuing to write Black Panther in this kind of wild and totally sort of left field zig move where Black Panther's in space. But he's also writing Captain America and really dealing with the fallout of Secret Empire in a way that I didn't expect, which has been fascinating. And then my number 5, which again is kind of a reach, is Thor and War of the Realms, but only taken as a piece of the entire Jason Aaron run. I think this particular segment of Thor with Jason Aaron and Mike Del Mundo at the helm is actually probably the weakest the run has been since 2012 when he being Aaron, with Esad Ribic on Thor God of Thunder. That said, as part of a whole, and including the build to and the event War of the Realms, it's a must read in my book. So again, they're comparable slates at the very high end. The difference here is that Marvel's core titles are much healthier than during the same comparison period. So the Avengers, Spider-Man, X-Men, they're all consistently in an enjoyable spot, or at least an interesting spot now, whereas during All New, All Different, those titles were weak. They were in a rough place. And I think when these titles are healthy, it allows some of the lower tier properties, things like Venom, Runaways, Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, these things can shine a little more easily. I think another thing Fresh Start has done very well is they've been very smart about doing 5-issue miniseries that allow creators to tell a full story without pretense about length. Rising star writer Donny Cates, who's the writer on Venom and the newly relaunched Guardians of the Galaxy, he's taken particular advantage of this format, and he's contributed 5-issue minis like Cosmic Ghost Rider, which is shockingly good, spinning out of the pages of Thanos Wins, a story he wrote, which could almost be considered a 6-issue mini, even though it's Thanos issues 13 to 18. Death of the Inhumans is a 5-issue mini, and there's the kind of curated thing that he contributed to of the Marvel Knights 20th anniversary. So I don't think it's yet at what I would consider the best era of the decade, Marvel Now, started in 2012. I don't think it's there in terms of quality, but Fresh Start does feel like the most consistently solid lineup of comics Marvel has published since 2015, and that is a good thing. There's some credit to be given there. As far as where we're headed in year two, here's what we know is on the horizon, and I'll share a little bit about how excited I am or not excited for them. We know that War of the Realms will be running through the summer, as I've already said. I am very excited to see how this ends, and I'm also excited to see how it builds to number 2, upcoming, a Valkyrie ongoing series written by Jason Aaron and L. Ewing. Ewing's probably my favorite Marvel writer since Jonathan Hickman finished his Secret Wars run. More on him in a second. And him teaming with Aaron, who's done fantastic work on Thor, on a Valkyrie series, has me very excited as well. Speaking of writer Jonathan Hickman, he's coming back to the Marvel Universe. He's going to be taking on the X-Men. We know there are going to be 2 6-issue miniseries, House of X and Powers of 10, even though it is the Roman numeral X, V confusing. But Hickman is my favorite Marvel writer of maybe ever. And him coming back to do X-Men is the most excited I could possibly be about anything in the Marvel Universe, and bodes very, very well for Marvel Year 2. Fresh Start Year 2. Speaking of Fresh Start Year 2 being exciting, there's an Absolute Carnage event coming by the Venom team of Donny Cates and Ryan Stegman. Again, I'm not a huge Venom guy. I'm not a huge Carnage guy. I like the way they look, but I don't necessarily love reading their comics as standalones. That said, Cates and Stegman have proved they know how to make this more interesting than the average Venom or Carnage story, and I'm pretty pumped to see Absolute Carnage come in the remainder of 2019. The one that I'm probably the most down on is this Acts of Evil mini event that has been teased. It sounds like it's going to run through a bunch of series annuals and play as, I think, a 30th anniversary for 1989's Acts of Vengeance, which is actually a very fun Marvel crossover where basically the idea here is the villains get together and they all discuss, they team up and they band together and decide to take on heroes that aren't in their normal arsenal of the heroes they fight. So you get, for example, Ultron takes on Daredevil, and that's a lot of fun. And Doctor Doom takes on the Punisher, I think, and that's a really cool issue. And the Fantastic Four fight a gazillion C-listers, and that's pretty entertaining. So it's a fun idea. Acts of Evil, it's probably going to be pretty harmless, but I'm kind of just feels like an anniversary for anniversary's sake. I'm not really sure how it's going to fit into the big picture, especially when compared to DC simultaneously running the Year of the Villain. It feels like they're trying to do the exact same thing, but with way less of a commitment. I'm not sold on Acts of Evil, but we'll see. And my big theory for the end of this year is that it's going to be 2020, 20th anniversary of Marvel's Ultimate Universe. I'm feeling an announcement about the relaunch of a new Ultimate Universe. I don't think they're going to bring the Ultimate Universe back. I don't think that makes any sense. It wouldn't be any good. But I think they're going to relaunch it entirely for a new generation of readers and give a new entry point that, when you see now today people trying to get into Marvel Comics, the Ultimate Universe is one of the most popular paths to do this. I've got a guide on Comic Book Herald, of course, that a lot of people have used and really enjoyed. But that's my big prediction for where Marvel Fresh Start Year 2 is going to take things going into 2020. So there you have it. It's a one-year recap of the Marvel Fresh Start initiative. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, you can always find Comic Book Herald on Twitter or social media, really anywhere. Of course, you can comment here wherever you are listening or